Good evening, and welcome to Author, a Simon & Schuster Centennial celebration.
What stagecraft the flatterers have fashioned for us on this day of commemoration, they somehow managed to get the heavens above to mark the occasion by providing a total solar eclipse this afternoon. So they set a spectacular tone for our grand family reunion tonight. Here on Earth, down below the heavens, it has been so much fun for me to absorb the storied history of the Simon & Schuster family, to learn of the unlikely genesis that sprang from two young Columbia University graduates, Richard Simon, a piano salesman, and Max Schuster, an arts and culture columnist. The two friends were united by a dream to establish a publishing house that would sell better books to more people at lower prices. No books, they pledged, would bear their name that they had not read, and they were not proud to stand behind. When they opened their doors on 57th Street on January 3rd, 1924, however, they had only one employee, a stenographer, and only one book on their spring list, a book of crossword puzzles. Now, crosswords in newspapers were all the rage at the time, and this was the first book to put together a series of puzzles. They had a first printing of 3,600 copies, $1.25 for each copy, and it included an eraser-capped pencil. But shortly before publication, Richard and Max began to have cold feet, fearful that their first offspring might make it seem that they were publishers of activity books and make it difficult for them to attract novels, poetry, and serious works of nonfiction. So they decided to hide the puzzle book under the name of Plaza Publishers in honor of the Plaza Hotel, where they had routinely met week after week to plan this big adventure. But then when the crossword book became a colossal bestseller, selling 100,000 copies in the first few weeks, Richard and Max decided the time had come to acknowledge their illegitimate offspring in an article in Publishers Weekly. The mysterious Plaza Books, they now proudly revealed, was a wholly owned subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. And in that same issue, our enterprising founders announced their first fall list, including 2 novels, 1 biography, 1 book of poetry, and 4 more puzzle books. By the end of 1924, the 5 crossword books had sold 1 million copies, and Richard Simon and Max Schuster were off and running. At which point, Max Schuster, who had admired Abraham Lincoln ever since high school, decided to adopt Lincoln as his middle name and would forever after sign his name M. Lincoln Schuster. So what better threesome could we have as our founding fathers? Richard Simon, Max Schuster, and their silent partner, Abraham Lincoln.
All right, and I guess finally, I would sort of like to ask you, how has your writing evolved through the years? How have you changed as a writer, or how has your process changed?
The process is the same. I enjoy it more. I don't have to force myself so much. I realize this is really the only thing of value that I do. And I used to do it because I had to do it, because comedians, if you don't create new material, you die. You have to do that to survive. So it was just something I would just force myself to do. And then after many, many years, I started to actually enjoy it. Now I really enjoy it a lot. But you inviting me to do the book was the only time I ever stopped and thought, well, gee, what happened to me? And, you know, how did I go from a kid in my room just wanting to do this thing that to me was like being an astronaut or a baseball player, and then I became that thing? How did that happen? And because you invited me to do the book, it forced me to stop and reflect on that, and that was a great experience, and I thank you for encouraging me to do it.
Well, thank you for writing the book. You once said that you kind of thought of yourself like as a singer-songwriter. Mm-hmm. That comedian, and you know, people forget that, you know, before he does the stand-up, it's all written and meticulously crafted. And as his editor, I can tell you that you were revising bits that were, you know, decades old, right up to the time we published.
Yeah, I just like to play with them. They're just Legos. Words, a good writer, words are Legos. They're toys to play with.
Hemingway's sentences were simple, filled with repetitions and odd variations, filled with an emotion which seemed to live in the space between the words. And I was no longer a bad barman. I was no longer a bad poet, I was living in a book. And that book opened up possibilities. Within 4 years, I would myself be living in Spain, as the characters in that novel do. Within a few years more, I had a typewriter, and I had an idea.
Now, I'd had a title, The Lions of Lucerne, because I'd been to Lucerne, Switzerland to do a show. I didn't know how I was going to work this incredible rock face, this thing that Mark Twain called the most moving piece of rock in the world, this carving to commemorate the Swiss Guard who died in the initial throes of the French Revolution. I said, but someday I'm going to use that title. The last night on our honeymoon that we had an overnight train, it was a shared train compartment. And we were in with a brother and sister from Atlanta, Georgia, and they recognized me from the TV show, and we talked all night about our shared love of books. And the next morning, the sister said, are you going to go make more TV shows? And I said, I'm going to write a novel. And she gave me her business card on the platform and said, I work for Simon & Schuster. If you read that novel, if you write that novel, I would like to read it. And I thought, this is great. I've got a title. I've told my wife I'm going to do it. I met somebody from Simon & Schuster. I just need an idea. We went to the hotel to check in, and the room wasn't ready. And the desk clerk said, if you go around the corner to this cafe, have a sandwich, come back, the room will be done. Cynical Chicagoan that I am, I figured his brother-in-law owned the cafe and that the rooms are never ready on time, and he sends everybody over there for a coffee and a sandwich. On the table next to me was an English language newspaper. I picked it up, and inside I found an article about a Swiss intelligence officer who had embezzled all this money from the Swiss government and was training his own shadow militia high in the Alps with high-tech weapons from his own private arsenal. That became The Lions of Lucerne. I'm now in my 24th book with Simon & Schuster. It's been my family the whole time.
My mother used to say to me, just be a good girl, Judy. Just be a good girl. But somehow, I don't know, I outgrew that.
I wonder what was considered a good girl to her.
A good girl was somebody who didn't give her any trouble.
Okay.
Right?
And your books have caused good trouble?
They have caused trouble.
Trouble?
I mean, there was the first one, so there were two guy principals. The first guy principal was the principal of my kids' elementary school. And, I was really proud when Are You There, God It's Me, Margaret was published. I was so proud. And I signed 3 books and I gave them to the school library. And the next thing I know, they were gone. And so I asked him, and he said, those books are inappropriate for 5th and 6th grade girls. It's like, wait, 5th and 6th grade girls, some of them already have their periods. And he was like, no.
How would he know?
And the next guy, principal, I'm sorry if any of you were men and you're principals, but this was a long time ago. Things have changed, I hope, except the books are still banned. But the next guy principal, it was about Deanie, and Deanie touched her special place.
She's the reason I don't go into my daughter's room for any reason.
He's got 4 daughters, you know. And he said to me, if it was about a boy, it would be normal. What?
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, another thing people told me that I couldn't do, because my mother was an English teacher, she still teaches sometimes in Moncks Corner, South Carolina. And so she would always tell me to read books that didn't pertain to me. And so we had the booking program as well. I don't know if y'all remember the booking program where you read 4 books and you get a free pizza. And so, I don't just look like a Ninja Turtle. I used to really like pizza. And so, I would go in the library and look for books that don't necessarily pertain to me. And that's how I started reading so much Beverly Clearly and Miss Judy Blume. And I remember people telling me I couldn't read those books because I was a young black male from Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and I'm like, it's great storytelling. I like Judy Blume the same way I like Jay-Z. Like, they're the same type of storytelling. Like, a good storyteller is a great storyteller. Anything else?
Well, there's more sex. So I wrote Forever. There's always more sex.
Always more
So
sex.
I wrote Forever.
Okay.
And I was told, you cannot do this. You cannot let a young woman enjoy her sexuality.
We're all here because a young woman enjoyed this. That's why we're here.
And I live in Key West, which happens to be, even though we deny it, in the state of Florida. That book is banned in the state of Florida.
Wow.
Because a young woman enjoys her sexuality.
A 6-word story came to me about a sideboard. And when I heard that story, I couldn't let go of it. Maybe it was because my grandmother in Birmingham, Alabama had a sideboard that she was so proud of. Wood, it was wooden, it had a marble top, and we used to have to polish the top of it. But the sideboard that this fellow wrote to me about from the Midwest was a sideboard that had been built by slaves. In fact, that was his 6 words. This sideboard is built by slaves. And I received that story, and then it took me a while to get back to him, because over time I've collected more than 500,000 stories, so it takes me a while to get back to everybody who's written to me. And all these things stay in my head such that I sometimes don't even know where my keys are, because I have so many stories in my head and so many fixations on the things that are in the story, but this one really stuck with me. And so I wrote to him and I said, I want to know more about the sideboard. And he responded and said, it's been destroyed. Huh, yeah. That was my response. I felt like I had been crushed. I was angry. I had to leave the house. I went and took a long walk. I was emotional. I actually shed a few tears over this. And I had to figure out how to call him, because I didn't want to confront him. I wasn't going to exactly wag a finger at him, but I kind of was. And I just wanted to know why he would destroy something, because I understood that it might have been difficult for him because of the history, the weight, both the physical weight and the weight of what that represented. But it meant something different, I guess, to me because of the people from whom I am descended. The people who made something like that. And when I finally got him on the phone, he explained, oh, no, it's not actually destroyed. Whew. But he gave it away. He couldn't find someone to take it because it was so big and heavy. He wanted to give it to a museum. Finally, he found someone who was willing to come to his state and take it because they were picking up a bunch of antiques. So they came and they took this thing, which weighed, it was like moving a piano, and took it away and moved it to a warehouse in Kansas. It was an antiques dealer took it. And as we talked, he explained to me why he just couldn't have it in his home. He's descended from people who once owned people. And that sideboard has been moving through a series of consecutive houses, getting smaller along the way. The house that they owned in the South was big, and then a smaller house, and then they moved to the Midwest in a smaller house. And he lives in a very small house, and he said, I didn't have room for this side table, but he also just didn't have room for it in his heart. He explained to me the reasons why, because he knew the history. He knew that it was built by slaves, and he knew why slaves did the building. Because in the part of the South that he was from, they built furniture from live oak, and if any of you have ever worked with wood, you know that live oak is a very, very hard kind of wood. You can cut 3 pine trees with a single saw. I see you nodding your head, you don't understand this. But it sometimes takes 3 saws to cut through a single trunk of live oak because it is so hard. And because it is so hard, the saw sometimes will fly off another direction. So when you go in a community and you know who was working on wood, because you would see the results of that, lost fingers, maiming, they'd lose arms, they'd have all kinds of cuts about them. So they decided, we're gonna let the enslaved do this work because it's just too dangerous. He taught me that, but it turned out I could teach him something also, because in the research I had done, I had learned about people who were enslaved, who built furniture, who also did ironwork, who built the balustrades and some of the architectural elements in the homes that we still live in today. And what I learned is that people who were unable to read and write, not because they lacked the intellect, but because people refused to allow them to learn how to read and write, developed their own language through their craft. Some of the enslaved told stories through the woodworking, through the dental molding, through the way that they carved certain things. They told stories of births and deaths and discoveries, and most likely disappointments. He wanted that piece of furniture destroyed. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to destroy it. I asked him, why did you tell me that it was destroyed? Because that destroyed me. And he said, because that's what I want to happen in my mind. I want to see it erased. I want to see it crushed. And I just can't understand that. I understand why people want to outrun a history. It's something that's
perhaps something we should be thinking about. And it makes me think about another 6-word story that has landed in my inbox. History is a complicated, demanding mistress. She will not be ignored. We know that right now, in the moment that we're living in, we get to choose our future in terms of climate change, in terms of electoral politics, in terms of how we treat each other. But there are a lot of people right now who are also invested in the idea that they get to choose their past. But do they? But should they? All I know is that I will never forget that sideboard. I never got to see it, and yet it's still in my mind. And the dude who lives in the Midwest, who inherited the sideboard but decided to give it away, he can't quite forget about it either. Whenever he calls the person who took it, they struck up a friendship, and he calls and he asks, how is it still there? Is it still in the warehouse? It turns out it is still in the warehouse, collecting dust. It's not in a dump yard. It has not yet been destroyed. It's still in the warehouse, but actually, it's kind of still in his house. It's still occupying space in his mind. It's still occupying real estate in my mind, and now that I've told you the story, it might occupy space in your minds also. It's still in the room, and that's kind of like our shared history in America. It's both beautiful and ugly, complicated and sticky, and impossible to outrun. I hope that that fellow in the Midwest changes his mind about wishing that a piece of furniture with that kind of energy would disappear from our earth, that sideboard. That piece of furniture is a little piece of America's history, and that sideboard still has stories to tell. And one of the stories that it has taught me, reminded me as a storyteller and a story collector, is that sometimes we think we are done with stories before they are done with us.
When I was 33, in 1982, I made my biggest mistake that led me to my biggest beneficial change. I calculated that American banks had lent more money to emerging countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that there would be a big debt crisis, which was controversial and got a lot of attention. Sure enough, Mexico defaulted on its debt in August 1982, and a number of countries followed. But the stock market went up rather than down because the Fed lowered its interest rates a lot. And that took me by surprise. I lost money for clients. I went broke. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to pay for my family bills. That painful experience was one of the best things that ever happened to me because it gave me the humility that I needed to balance with my audacity. It taught me how to diversify, to reduce my risks without reducing my returns. And it led me to think about and write down my life and work principles to produce outcomes that I wanted.
Back in the early 1940s, Simon & Schuster began putting out a line of books that were meant for very young readers. They were called the Little Golden Books. You all remember the Little Golden Books, right? Yeah. So there was one book in that series that was a particular favorite of mine and my brothers and my sister. It was called The Happy Family. It was one of those books where the title said it all. It was about this impossibly happy family. There was a mother and a father. They had a little boy, a little girl, a cat and a dog. They lived in this nice little suburban tract house. And they drove, I swear to God, a station wagon. You know, in truth, not much happens in the Happy Family. There's a birthday party that they hold in the backyard, and a little bit later they go for a beach outing. And about the most exciting thing that happens across the course of the story is some ants try to get at the birthday cake in the backyard. Yeah, in terms of what we think of as compelling plot, it's about as insipid as you could get. So, why did my brothers and my sister and I clamor for our father to read that book to us night after night? Well, honestly, if he'd read it the way it was written, we'd have grown tired of it pretty quickly, but my father never did that. He would read the first few lines as they were written on the page, and then he would go off on his own, and God alone knew where we'd end up. So for example, those ants that try to get at the birthday cake in the backyard, and my father's telling of that tale, those weren't just regular ants, those were giant ants. And they weren't just after the birthday cake, they were after the Happy Family. And that beach outing that they go to later where the waves lap gently against the shoreline. And my father's telling, those became tidal waves and they swept up the happy family, and the happy family had to fight for their lives. And always one of my favorite parts of the book was the ending. The story as it's written, I believe, ends something like this. And Father turned out the light and said, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite." My father never ended the story that way. In his ending, it would go something like this. And Father turned out the light and said, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite." But when he came to wake the children in the morning, the bed bugs had gobbled them all up. So what's my point? My point is simply this, that what I learned from my father's reading of that little golden book, or probably more appropriately his non-reading of that little golden book, was that a story once begun can go anywhere. You're limited only by the reach of your own imagination.
My name is Fredrik Backman. I'm here tonight because my agent said that this would be good for my career. She said I need to learn how to speak in front of people. It will be fun, she said. So I told her that I write books. I spend 8 hours every day locked inside a room with people I have made up. If I was comfortable talking to real people, I would have a real job. But my agent said, you know, just go up there and talk about the life of a writer. And I said, all right. Being a writer is the best way I know how to get paid for being insane. I only have 4 minutes. My brain and I, we are not friends. My brain and I, we are classmates doing a group assignment called Life, and it's not going great. So my agent, upon hearing this, said, which is American for I could have been a lawyer. And then she said, maybe you can talk about how you suffer from creative anxiety, Fredrik. And I said, I don't suffer from creative anxiety. And my agent said, well, everyone around you suffer. So I explained that I don't have creative anxiety. I just have, this is just normal death anxiety. And sometimes I have panic anxiety if I'm in a hurry and I need to have a lot of anxiety all at once. But I don't have creative anxiety. I never get writer's block. And the secret is easy, it's procrastination. I don't want to brag, but I'm very good at procrastination. I'm going to have a writer's block, I just haven't gotten around to it yet. I am so good at procrastination that the only reason that I am here tonight is because I'm supposed to be finishing a book right now. But my anxiety is not creative, my anxiety is Scandinavian, because I am from Sweden. And now in America, Sweden is often confused with Switzerland, but we are very different. In Switzerland, they have chocolate and watches. In Sweden, we have IKEA and depression. Swedish depression is just like American depression, but it's cheaper and you have to assemble it yourself. Some parts may be missing, so if someone in here is depressed tonight and don't know why, then you might be Scandinavian. Of course, some of you will think that because I am Scandinavian, I must write crime novels, but I find murder to be too much work. So instead, I write novels about characters who could murder someone, but they haven't gotten around to it yet. Now, I wrote this speech on the airplane from Sweden to America, which was great because of the time difference. Americans call that jet lag, I call it a procrastinator's dream. Because Sweden is 6 hours ahead of New York, so I left home Sunday evening, and when I arrived here, it was still Sunday evening. The customs official asked me where I was traveling from, and I answered, the future. So, if you hear a strange sound now, that's my agent regretting her career choices. But it's too late now, Ariel. So, in conclusion, I am here tonight with all of my anxiety, because I know that in this room there might be someone who is dreaming about writing a book, dreaming of becoming an author. So I'm here to tell you that I am, obviously, an idiot. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I became an author anyway. So you can too. And I hope that one day I will be able to tell my agent that the reason that my next book is not finished yet is because I was busy reading yours.
I am Christina.
And I am Lauren, and for those of you who don't know us, we are best friends who write romance together as Christina Lauren.
We get asked a lot of questions about co-authoring, like, do you disagree?
Which is code for, do you fight?
Yes. Who writes the sex scenes?
Code for, who is the biggest piglet?
And what kind of relationship does it take to write and publish over 30 books together?
All of them with Simon & Schuster. And to answer that question, we have a story.
Oh my God, you guys, it's about feet.
No, not that story.
Okay, yes, that story. So here's the scene. It's December, and our friend Laura texts and asks me if I have pics of Lo's feet.
Okay, I'm sorry. You cannot say it like that without context. For context, she was having Christmas ornaments made, and she needed to know the font that I use for the tattoos on my feet.
Yes, okay. So I didn't have any. I know this is shocking, but I said that I would get them. So I'm sure Laura thought that I was going to be really stealthy about this. Like, maybe I would visit Lo and I would take a few while I was there, or maybe I would ask her kids, but no, I just texted Lo and I said, hey, I need pics of your feet. And did she ask me why? No. What did you say?
I said, okay, just don't post them anywhere.
She said, just don't post them anywhere. And that is why this relationship works. Find somebody you trust not to sell pics of your feet on the internet.
Somewhere in a small fishing village in Montego Bay, Jamaica, is a young girl whose life and fate seem fixed by poverty. The libraries in her hometown are scarce, and there are no books present in her seaside home. Here, young girls are not encouraged to follow their dreams. Towering on either side of her home are hotels she's forbidden from entering because she is a local. But the kitchen women in the hotels have taken a liking to her and allow her to rummage through the trash heap where the tourists leave their coffee-stained books behind as they return to their far-off worlds. And there, in the pages of a book, this young girl finds hope. In books, she discovers a future where she is possible. She can't leave the confines of this life, but she can escape. This young girl is my mother. She followed her love of literature until it led to me, her first daughter, here on this stage, the unlikeliest dream of all, a poet. When I was 10 years old and a young daughter of Rastafari, I was teased and scorned and cast aside at school because of my dreadlocks and because I was part of the Rastafari faith. I didn't have many friends at school. Even my teachers treated me badly. But I did have one friend, and we spent most of our days together. Then, one day at the end of the school year, she sent a boy with a note for me. I unfurled it alone at my desk, and it said, "Please leave me alone. I don't want to be a friend. I don't want to be friends with a Rasta." Just then, my selfhood withered. My pain, my little hydra, unfurled and did not stop. This was the first time I felt ashamed to be myself. So I decided to barter one pain for another. I saw a rusty nail outside the classroom and I stepped down on it hard, harming myself. I told everyone it was an accident, but my mother somehow knew that it wasn't and saw that I needed help. So while on bed rest, she handed me my first book of poems and she said she thought it would help me. And she told me that poetry was a thing that had always made her world seem wild and wide and warmer. And then she laughed and she said that was alliteration. I said, "What is alliteration?" And then the damage was done. As she spoke to me about her love of poetry, I slowly began to feel all my hurt evaporate into something else, into wonder. And after my mother left me in my room, I flipped through the poems and I read one of her favorites, which was William Blake's The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? I felt those words blaze alive in a way that nothing ever had before. The poem's images prowled the neon jungle of my mind, and in that moment, I was inspired to write my first poem, called The Butterfly, in imitation of Blake. But writing this poem was my first spiritual experience, one of stepping through the veil of this world into another world, and slowly, viscerally, feeling all the hurt that hooked its talons into me, all the pain of my rejection, and that note fade to ash, all burned away to wonder. I knew then that what my mother handed to me that day was gold. My mother, who still recites the words to my poems in the front row of my readings and says, I just can't believe I have my own personal poet. My mother, who loves books and poetry and literature so much that she gifted its magics to me, her daughter, so sensitive and porous to this world, and she created the unlikeliest poet. I followed the gold thread of her words that day into poetry, into writing my own books. And I knew that as long as I followed that thread wherever it led me, I would always be all right. With language and poetry and literature as my guide, I would always survive. This is the power of books. This is the power of poetry. For opening just a little bit more of the world to girls like my mother, girls like me. And I know now, as long as there is a poem that leaps a flame in my mind, I will always be living in an age of wonder.
Here's a sentence that many of us have read before. Where's Papa going with that axe? Fern asks her mother. Of course, that's E.B. White in the first line of Charlotte's Web. And when you hear that sentence without any effort at all, you start playing a little movie in your head. You see a little girl and her mother, and already you know that Papa was just here, but now he's gone, and Fern wants to know why he strode by with all things an axe. Now, if you're a writer, you may be thinking, yeah, of course, that's what writers do. They conjure images, they conjure ideas if you do it right. Words conjure emotions too. But as a psychologist, I urge us all to reckon with the miracle of words. Where's Papa going with that axe? Fern asks her mother. Just like that, all of us watching the same movie, a movie that E.B. White conjured in his imagination one day a very long time ago. Literally, and here finally I really mean it literally we are reading E.B. White's mind.
The first stories, told around fires, passed on lessons of battle and of the hunt, in an effort to keep the family, the tribe, the community, and even the species alive. We are all here today because our ancestors listened to those stories, heeded their lessons, and in turn, passed them on to the next generation. We all share this connection to the past. We are all here today because of the power of story. The last century has been no different, though the technology has certainly changed. Richard Connell's Most Dangerous Game, first published 100 years ago in 1924, takes us back to the early decades of the 20th century. Jeffrey Household's Rogue Mail delivers us to the eve of World War II. Thrillers and mysteries of the early to mid-40s are fascinating for how they dealt or didn't with the war that engulfed the planet. Ian Fleming brings us to international locations of the 1950s and early 60s through the lens of the British position in the post-war world. Jean Le Carré takes us on missions of the early Cold War in all its moral ambiguity. David Morrell transports us back to the early 1970s to an America divided over Vietnam in First Blood. We continue into the 1980s with Rambo's creator as he brings together the most compelling elements of US and UK espionage thrillers in his Brotherhood of the Rose trilogy. Starting in the 1970s, Nelson DeMille, Robert Ludlum, and Frederick Forsyth begin to immerse us in the worlds of crime and spycraft. This same time machine takes us beneath the waves with a young Jack Ryan and Tom Clancy's The Hunt for Red October, in a showdown with the Soviet Navy in what was to be their final decade. We meet Pulitzer Prize winner Stephen Hunter's Bob Lee Swagger in the 90s and see the world through the eyes of a Vietnam veteran 20 years removed from the conflict in Southeast Asia. The novels of my youth transported me back to World War II, the Cold War in Vietnam, and others were contemporary thrillers that now facilitate my time travel back to the 1980s and 90s. It was Simon & Schuster, Atria, and Emily Bestler books author, the late great Vince Flynn, who gave us the legendary Mitch Rapp in thrillers that I would read on my way to Iraq and Afghanistan. His books bridge the divide between the pre- and post-9/11 worlds, ultimately giving us a hero for the 21st century, a hero who resonated not just with Americans, but readers around the world. Vince's books are now a time machine, bringing readers and listeners back to the years of the global war on terror. A post-war on terror phase in the thriller genre began following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. This era is still being defined, but future readers and listeners will one day turn to the thrillers of today to be transported back to this time.
The most precious gift I ever received was a really wacky childhood. But for much of my life, I did everything that I could to hide the details of that story. I love hearing other people's stories, but I thought nobody would understand mine. It's just so nutty and sometimes dark and sometimes magical, but always chaotic. And I did everything I could to hide that. I became a journalist and told other people's stories, but went to great lengths to hide my own. I'd become quite friendly with another journalist, and he told me everything about his life, but I kept quiet about mine. And then finally one day I figured I just had to come clean. So I told him one day, I said, you know, there's some things you should know about me. I had a kind of weird childhood. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, when I was 3 years old, I was cooking hot dogs for myself and my dress caught on fire. And I had to be taken to the hospital and I got a bunch of skin grafts and stuff like that. And he said, what are you trying to tell me? I said, I'm covered with nasty scars. And he said, why are you telling me this? I said, well, I'm a little dinged up. I'm kind of damaged goods. And he said, you're apologizing? He said, oh, no. Don't ever apologize for those scars. He said, those scars are a sign that you survived and that you are stronger than whatever you were up against. And I said, I just wish I was nice and smooth like other people. And he said, oh, no. Smooth is boring. You have texture. He said, texture is really interesting. So I married that man. I married him and he pulled my story out of me. And he urged me to get it published. And I gotta tell you, I was so wrong about people. They understand my story. They are so compassionate and empathetic. And often in exchange for my having told my story, they share their stories with me. And sometimes they're crying and they'll say, I'm so ashamed of this. I've never told anybody before, but I thought you would understand. And I'm thinking, why would you be ashamed of that? That's a beautiful story. And we're, oh yeah, that's the way that I felt too. And one time I traveled to this really well-to-do area, southern Florida, and we're talking major money. And I told that story about what my husband had said about wanting to be smooth and like everybody else and not have texture. And him saying that smooth is boring and texture is interesting. And afterwards this woman comes up to me and she says, sweetie, come here. Let me explain something to you. And she said, there is no such thing as smooth. She said, you look close enough, silk's got texture. And I thought that that's the wisest and kindest thing that anybody has ever said to me. And that is why I share it with you all today. We're all a little dinged up. We all have our texture. And what I ask of you is that if you are lucky enough to have the silky texture, don't think that that somehow makes you less strong or less fascinating. And if you are lucky enough to have texture that's a little bit rougher, don't ever be ashamed of that. It is your texture. They are your scars. They are your stories. And sharing them can change your life.
My recording of it has been used in over 40 motion pictures and TV shows, so you've probably heard this before, but this time you may want to follow the storyline. worn out recording of a favorite song. So while she lay there sleeping, I read the paper in bed. And in the personal column, there was this letter I read. It goes, if you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, if you're not into yoga, if you have half a brain, if you like making love at midnight in the dunes on the Cape, then I'm the love that you looked for. Write to me and escape. Now to save time, I'll explain that the hero replies to the ad and arranged to meet the woman who placed the ad at a barcode at Mally's the very next day. And he says, so I waited with high hopes. She walked into place. I knew her smile in an instant. I knew the curve of her face. It was my own lovely lady. And she said, oh, it's you. And we stared at each other. And I said, I never knew that you like pina coladas, getting caught in the rain, and the feel of the ocean, and the taste of champagne. If you'd like making love at midnight in the dunes on the Cape, then I'm the love that you've looked for. Come with me and escape. Come with me and escape. Happy birthday, SNS. Please have 100 minutes.